etiquette around the table as the Dungeon Master and rules that you can use to kind of help that out. But before we jump into that segment, we're going to have some announcements just to talk about what's happening in Dungeons & Dragons world and let people know about all the fun stuff that's happening on the D&D channel here on Twitch. This week, we got another crazy long week. It's the week of PAX West is happening this weekend. So Chris Perkins and the Acquisitions Incorporated crew, plus Holly Conrad from Dice Camera Action, are all getting ready for that, including Danny Hartel, who was just on this channel on Craft Hags. I'm not sure if we were hosting her, but I'm pretty sure we were. She's making the costume for Chris Perkins for his PAX West show this Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, which you can watch here. It's going to be amazing. I can't wait. It's a lot of preparation has been going into it, and it's going to be super fun. So that was the first announcement. PAX West is this weekend. There's a couple of panels. I will be there, but the big thing is the Live West game. And again, Holly Conrad is joining them. If you want some like little preview of her hanging out with Patrick Rathfuss as Viari and Mike Krahulik as Jim Darkmagic, you can check the Acquisitions Incorporated website, which is AC Inc. essentially. Where is it here? acq-inc.com. There's a podcast that kind of introduces Strix into the world of Acquisitions Incorporated. It's really fun. We had Patrick Rothfuss as a special Dragon Talk episode last Friday. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out. It's in the Collections tab now. It will be on YouTube soon, and it will be coming to you in podcast form very soon. So that's pretty interesting and exciting. Dragon Plus has got a new issue coming out this week as well. I think it's coming for Thursday. If you don't know what Dragon Plus is, it is an app that you can download for your iOS or Android phones, and you can check it out on the web at dragonmag.com. There's tons of great information, interviews about upcoming storylines, as well as deep dives with our friends and developers who are doing lots of great work in the D&D world. And, of course, Tomb of Annihilation is going to be a big theme for this issue because it's coming out next month. So I suggest on Thursday you check out Dragon Plus, download the new issue, and keep Dragon Plus on your phone because it has a great feature, which I'm not sure a lot of people know about, is that if you have it on your phone, you can check in, open the app, and it has all of the posts on Twitter, all of our posts on Facebook, everything on the website, kind of put in one list, amortized all into one list so that people can all check it out. So good feature to have around when you're ready. There's no sound, apparently. Oh, but now there is. Someone hit the mute button. You guys got it back? Someone said it works, so that makes it okay now. Okay, good. I just checked in with the chat. How are you guys doing? You didn't hear any of that, did you? That's the wonder of streaming online, is that now I have to do all those amazing... Now I was like in the back of my head, I'm like, man, I'm really nailing these announcements.
We were.
No one heard them except for you, Jeremy.
And it means since we were muted, they weren't hearing me murmuring in Elvish. It was the only time I will do that publicly. So they missed it.
They missed it all. You were busy casting spells in silence. Oh, man. Well, I'm glad. Okay, good. You guys got most of them. Great. I won't deluge you with all of them again. But I will say that Force Grey, Lost City of Omu is coming tonight. That's right. Episode 6 will be happening around 5 p.m. Pacific time. We got a long and amazing slew of segments and interviews here for you coming here for Dragon Talk. And then we're going to lead right into me and Bart talking a little bit about Episode 6 and what that means for Force Grey, Lost City of Omu. And then we'll show you the half-hour episode. So stick around for that. If you haven't caught up yet with Force Grey, it's pretty amazing. There's Joe Manganiello, Deborah Ann Wall, Brian Udkarsh, that's not how it works, Udkarsh and Budkar, Brian Posehn, Dylan Sprouse, and Matthew Mercer as Dungeon Master for that amazing crew. I couldn't get a more star-studded group of D&D players if I tried, but I might have to try and get more stars.
Try harder, Greg.
Try harder, yeah. It's me. It's, you know, I blame myself. As you should.
Yes.
Right.
We all blame you.
There's a hashtag for it and everything. Oh, man. So stick around for that. Again, Twitch subscriptions are live, so thank you so much for all of you who have subscribed already. If you do it in the middle of this and I don't see it, please definitely pop it out. But I will definitely thank everybody who has subscribed for basically letting us do all this fun stuff on the web, on this Twitch streaming. All of your contributions go towards making this channel better and better, and so we will be doing that and bringing it all to you. And, of course, you get some fun emotes and badges and no ads when you're reading them. Hey, Jade Saro just subscribed with Twitch Prime. That's the way to do it. Thank you, sir. That's how I subscribe to this channel on my Twitch Prime account. You should all do it too. It's fun stuff. But again, thank you for all of that. We have one more fun thing I'm going to talk about, which is called Podcasts of Annihilation. We announced this last week. The audio live play community of Dungeons & Dragons saw what we did with Stream of Annihilation. They're like, we want to be involved too, and I thought that was an amazing idea. There's a lot of really creative Dungeon Masters and players playing in the audio-only format that are not video streaming that we wanted to make sure we were highlighting them as well. Shout out to Josh Peralt from the Taking Initiative podcast who came to me with this idea, and we got 10 podcasts to participate. It's going to be on the Dungeon Delve RSS feed. So go to podcasts on the D&D website, and you'll see that there's the Dragon Talk, which is this podcast, and then Dungeon Delve. We haven't updated it a lot recently, but we're going to start on September 18th through the 22nd doing 10 new episodes from some of our favorite podcasts. So we've got Nerd Poker, who is Brian Possehn's group, that we had the Dungeon Master Dan Tefler on recently on Dragon Talk. We've got Drunks and Dragons, Venture Maidens, Dungeon Rats, Dungeon Drunks. A lot of drinking and D&D is happening, apparently. D&D's for Nerds, You Meet in a Tavern, as well as the Sneak Attack podcast and Encounter Roleplay, in addition to Taking Initiative, which was Josh's podcast. So thank you guys so much for that. I can't wait to listen to all of their episodes as they come in. And I have a nice little bumper right here that I printed out that I need to read to everyone to put it in the front so everybody knows exactly what's happening with those episodes. So mark your calendars, Dungeon Delve, September 18th, which is not coincidentally, I did it on purpose, the exact same date and week that Tomb of Annihilation comes out in a wide release. So everyone can get it then.
Coming very soon.
We have a physical copy in the office, but we neglected to bring it.
Yeah, not in my stack of books here.
Damn it! In between this break here, we'll definitely go and grab it so you can all drool over the one physical copy that we have in the office right now. Very cool stuff. And Jeremy, you said you were putting the finishing touches on Xanathars. We got our proofs back from
the printer. Yes, I just approved the final changes. And now we're waiting to see what those corrected final pages look like, and then they will hit print in their massive printer.
Yeah, and that will be in stores November 10th with the alt cover available in game stores as well as the regular cover, and then November 21st wide everywhere for Xanathars. And I know a lot of people are excited about all the player options as well as the DM options in that book. Me included.
Yes. I already am using some of the tools that are in that book.
Nice. Yeah. Good stuff. All right, cool. Well, thank you guys so much for bearing with us on these announcements. We're going to get right into recording a Sage Advice segment right about now. You're good? Nice. You could hear the little click, click, click. Hello and welcome to Sage Advice, a segment of the Dragon Talk podcast in which we delve in deep to parts of the Dungeons & Dragons rules and talk about kind of the intent and the design behind them as well as tips that you can use. And I'm here with Jeremy Crawford.
Hello, everyone.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
You excited to jump into DM etiquette is what we call this topic right. Of how to use rules that are in the game to kind of deal with problems that kind of arise for dungeon masters, like problem players or situations that are hard to defuse.
Yeah. And sometimes people will talk about this area of the game as table rules. So rather than being the rules for the system, it's really how do you run your game table.
Oh, yeah.
And also how do you use the rules at the game table, both as a dungeon master and as a player. So, when you and I were talking about this, and I was thinking, well, is there really enough for us to talk about? And then I was starting to jot down notes. I was like, oh, wait, there's plenty to talk about.
Yeah, right.
Because there are a lot of things that dungeon masters do to keep a table running that often we as DMs aren't even aware that we're doing it, or that we have different methods of keeping the game moving, keeping our players happy, making sure looking up rules doesn't cause everything to grind to a halt. All of these things sort of flow into the art of the dungeon master. So the thing I wanted to lead with is, first off, because I am a big proponent of DMs in particular doing as little work as possible.
At the table itself.
Yes, and even away from the table. I often recommend that DMs, so that they avoid burnout. So here, I'll right away stop. So this isn't even a table rule. This is just a DM etiquette rule for DM. Make sure you don't burn out as a DM.
Yeah.
This is a hobby for those of us who love playing and DMing D&D. Try, if you can, when you're preparing for a session, try to limit your preparation time to no more than half the length of the session you're expecting to run. So let's say you're planning on running a 4-hour session. Try to spend no more than 2 hours preparing for it. Now, many of us, because we love building worlds and creating maps and coming up with pantheons of gods, will spend way more time than that.
Yeah.
But although how I kind of rationalize as a DM when I'm starting to spend a lot of time in preparation, how I rationalize spending all that time is I separate out my world building time from my session preparation time.
Yeah, because they're two different parts of not even the brain, but just of what you need to get in your brain. So like world building, you could spend hours and hours and hours and hours, and that's always good because the more you think you know about that world, the better in general.
Right.
You don't want to spend too much time of stuff where people aren't necessarily going to explain, but at least it goes in the brain matter and you can access it later.
And if you're running published adventures, rather than spending your time world building, you could spend that time reading the adventure you're going to run. You could spend that time reading up about the world you're running your adventure in. So if you're running, say, Storm King's Thunder or soon Tomb of Annihilation, you could be reading up on the Sword Coast or on Chult. And if you're creating your own world, again, you're creating all of these details and whatnot. That to me is separate from the prep you do for a particular session. Like, okay, what's going to happen in tomorrow's D&D session?
Yeah.
And getting ready for that. And that's the kind of prep where I'm like, try to keep it so that you're not spending too much time on that, partly because you can never predict everything that's going to happen. And I find DMs will often end up preparing way more than they need to, which is not a terrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
But again, with the goal of making sure this still feels like it's a fun hobby for you, you don't want to burn out, just so it keeps being a delight for you.
Yeah, because the last thing you want to do is prep like 10 different scenarios. Be like, well, I'm sure my players will pick one of these 10 scenarios, and you spend 4 hours building those 10 scenarios, then of course they do the 11th scenario that you didn't anticipate, and then you're like, well, what did I do all that for?
Right. And that's also why I'm also, so one of my other table rules that I would give to DMs, and really this is advice, this is not a rule, is try to let none of your preparation go to waste. And so let's say the players run off and do something that you never expected. And you spent all your prep time preparing for them going to the Temple of Darkness, and they decided to dash off to the Temple of Light, and you have nothing prepared for it. First off, just be comfortable winging it, because the thing that DMs often forget is the players have no idea what you prepared. Yeah. And they have no idea what's behind your DM screen.
It's not like they're over your shoulder being like, oh, when are you going to get this into the campaign?
And so in essence, you're never doing it wrong if you put something in front of them that you didn't prepare, because they don't know you didn't prepare it. Yeah. What matters is just simply that whatever you put in front of them, it's fun, it's engaging them, and it's giving them a D&D experience that they're going to remember, or at least just have a ball with that afternoon or that evening when you're playing.
Is there a corollary to that in which you don't telegraph that you just are making this up? Like, don't telegraph that you're winging it?
Oh, I always, as a DM, basically try to have a poker face, and I will present something I painstakingly prepared, sometimes for weeks in advance. I will present it the same way I present something I made up on the spot. I try to just, as I'm delivering the story, I'm a storyteller. What matters is delivering that story. It doesn't matter if I made up element B 2 seconds ago and I've been planning this other element for 6 months.
Right.
The goal is just weave it all together, because, again, there's no need for you as a DM to be nervous. They don't know what's in your notes.
I like that you mentioned it's a poker face thing, too, because in poker, there's the if you're bluffing, you sometimes show that you bluffed just to be like, hey, I was bluffing, so you knew that I was bluffing. And then sometimes you don't show, even if you have the stuff, for that reason, to keep that mystery. And I do that as a DM sometimes, too, where I'm like, after a session, I'll be like, I totally just winged that. And they're like, what? Oh, my gosh, that's crazy. And then other times I'll be like, yeah, no, I've been prepping that for weeks, that thing that I just made up out of my butt. And, and so, like, it keeps them guessing a little bit.
And a funny anecdote with this is currently Chris Perkins is playing in my campaign, but in 4th edition, I used to play in his. And it's funny, actually, he and I sit we're in the same like relationship to each other at the table as we were back then, because when I'm DMing, he always sits immediately to my right, so he can kind of see over my DM screen.
Yeah.
And in our 4th edition game, I was often sitting also right next to him and could see over his DM screen. And Chris often does this, where his poker face is he'll look down at his paper. Like when something happens, like, someone says, oh, I meet this NPC, and he'll look at a paper as if he's looking at the NPC's name, and I'll look over and it's like, there's nothing on that piece of paper.
It's a completely blank sheet of paper.
Yep.
Oh,
he's
nice.
making it up on the spot,
Yeah.
which that's a part of the magic of D&D. Again, all your players care about is that it feels like a cohesive story, a sequence of events and locations. They don't know where it came from. Now, I mentioned before, I like also to make sure preparation doesn't go to waste.
Yeah.
So if you spend a bunch of time preparing something, as long as you don't get too wedded to the particular way in which you prepared it. Like I mentioned before, they decided to march off to the Temple of Light, and you prepared the Temple of Darkness. Well, in some cases, you can take the preparation you did for something else and just rapidly reskin it for another situation.
Yeah.
Like, Temple of Darkness was filled with bad guys, and they were going to fight them, and it was going to be a traditional dungeon slog. Oh, God, instead they're going to this other temple, and I don't even know what's really there. How about it's filled with the same bad guys? And so then you could just take your prep that you did for something else and dump it in another location. Usually, though, what I do is I'll take something I prepared that we didn't end up using it, and I'll end up using it many sessions later.
Yeah.
And we'll often, reskin it. Or another thing I love is, especially if you're designing wilderness situations, because they're not, you're not walking down fixed corridors and whatnot, and you might have thought, okay, if they go down this particular road, they're going to come across this strange forest shrine where they're going to hear the whispers of an old god. Oh, darn, they never went down that road. But again, they don't know what road that shrine is on. So in play, you can just take it and move it someplace else. And I would even recommend to DMs, be this free-flowing even when you're running published adventures and using an established world like the Forgotten Realms. What I often like to remind DMs is the moment you start using a published adventure and have your players step into a world like the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Dragonlance or Eberron or any other D&D setting, at that moment it becomes your world, and the published adventure you're running is your adventure. And it's going to be unlike, even if you run it exactly by the book, because of the choices your players are going to make, it's going to be unlike anyone else's version of it. And so I really encourage DMs, grasp onto that freedom, grasp onto the fact that it's going to be a unique experience for you. And don't fret if you realize after the fact, like you reread through the adventure, and it's like, oh, I described this fruit stall being on the left side of the street in Waterdeep, when in fact the adventure said it was on the right side.
Everything is ruined.
Yeah,
I can't suspend my disbelief anymore.
Yeah, who cares? Because again, it's now your version of Waterdeep.
Exactly.
And you decide now in this instance of it. It's a unique instance of Waterdeep. It's all yours. You decide how things work there. This is also a great thing to keep in mind when you have players who maybe have played in one of these worlds for many years, sometimes for decades. You can often surprise them because, again, the timeline they're in basically is different from anyone else's. Now, it gets a little trickier when you're running, say, like an Adventurers League, our official organized play. Then, because you're trying to create this sense of everyone playing in the same instance of the world, then people want to keep a little closer to the text. But here's the thing. There's a lot you can still play fast and loose with. At this most recent Gen Con, there was an Adventurers League adventure I was running. It's a lot of fun. It has a dinosaur race in it and an arena fight.
Nice.
And I ran that adventure multiple times. Every time I ran it, I changed something in the adventure. The team that they were racing against in the dinosaur race, I described them differently every time I ran it, mostly to amuse myself. And my favorite one was the final one where, for whatever reason, I decided one of the racers had a jack-o'-lantern helmet on his head, and the players really laughed about that, about this dinosaur rider with this jack-o'-lantern helmet. I don't know why the heck I did it, but I just decided on the spot this guy has a jack-o'-lantern helmet on.
Yeah.
But none of the other versions of the adventure I ran had the jack-o'-lantern helmet. I even sometimes will change the genders of the characters. The adventure, you go talk to this NPC named Pockmark Poe, and it said he's with 2 women. Well, I decided, and 2 young women, I decided, no, one of them is a middle-aged woman and the other one is a young man. And suddenly turn those 2 characters into sort of interesting NPCs for the people to meet.
Neat.
So again, make it your own. Don't let your preparation go to waste. So some other things for a DM to do. One thing I love to tell my players, especially at conventions, to try to keep the game moving when it comes around to their turn in combat, is if players are going to cast a spell in particular, make sure before your turn comes up to already have your player's handbook open to the spell you're going to cast.
Yeah. Or the spell card.
Or the spell card, or if you're using D&D Beyond, have that, have your screen with the spell ready to go.
Yeah.
Because often what will happen is someone will say, all right, I cast Gust of Wind. And then we're like,
you're like, what does it do?
And so what does Gust of Wind do?
Right.
And
what's
then
the saving throw I have to make?
And then, okay, now let's flip through it. Now they read it. Then they discover it doesn't actually do what they thought it did.
Yeah.
And that's almost like, okay, if you're playing a spellcaster, please read the spell before you cast it and have it open, because often people will have questions.
Right. And even if you don't have that stuff available to you, one thing I do on my character sheet is take very brief notes on the spell. So you put like 60 feet. That's the range. If it's a dex save, just put dex. And just put like little notes like that. So like the major components of, it's kind of like what the top of the spell description does. But if you can make really tiny notes on your sheet, most of those questions in play are going to be fine. And once you remember them, and it's easy. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. This principle also holds for complex class features. So, there are some class features that can be as complex as a spell. Some of the channel divinity options that the cleric and the paladin have. Again, I'd like my players to have it open. Sometimes, I appreciate it. Sometimes they imagine I have all the book in my head, and I've seen players do this with other DMs as well. Well, surely my DM knows how all this stuff works.
All it is, right? But then, as you mentioned on this segment many times before, you have the current version of the rules in your head. You have every playtest version of the rules in your head, including other editions and other editions playtest rules in your head. So it's very hard to be like, what's the printed thing that I need to reference right now?
And what I've noticed is that doesn't happen only to those of us who work on the game. I've actually seen a lot of people who've played the game edition after edition after edition. They'll often be haunted by how things used to work and not realize it. They'll think, oh, surely this is what this spell does, or surely this is how this works. And it turns out, well, it hasn't actually worked that way in D&D in about 10 years. But I know why you think that.
Shout out to anybody in 5th edition who's called for a spot check or a listen check for that reason.
Or occasionally someone will talk about flanking, but not the optional rule in the Dungeon Master's Guide. They actually mean flanking, how it worked in 3rd and 4th edition.
Exactly, yeah. So it's good to have the most recent stuff at your fingertips, at least, so that you can make combat go faster.
Now, that said, if you don't have it open, and for whatever reason the group is having trouble finding the rule that they're using, one bit of another good table rule is if it's starting to take too long, the key is for the DM to keep things moving and to be okay with making a rules call and just being comfortable with it and moving right along. Now, sometimes people will say, okay, then the DM should write down how he or she made that ruling, and it must be the same way forevermore. I think that's less important. What's important is that just things kept moving and people had a good time. Because you might sometimes realize when you go back to the books or think about it some more, like, oops. Maybe that's not a ruling I want to repeat.
There could be some, that could have been done differently. Like, you start to edit yourself.
Yeah, and what's important, again, is, was the story great? Did people laugh? Were they scared if it's supposed to be a scary adventure? Was it dramatic if it's supposed to be a dramatic adventure? Mm-hmm. The end of the day in D&D, there's no special prize for, well, I got every rule right. Now, that can be satisfying, sure.
We should give that prize out. But yeah, you're right. Like, it's all about whether or not the experience itself was fun, and any of the things we're talking about are ways that the experience can drag down.
Yeah. Now, something else, and this is going to be a one, some people say this is a silly table rule to bring up, but I always like to make sure, even in convention games that go over an hour in length, always have a break. And I say that, because people have to go to the bathroom. People need to get drinks and food. But also people like to chat about things other than the game. What part of my motive also of having breaks is I find that the more often I give breaks in a game, the less likely people are to spend time on their phones during the game, because often during those breaks, that's when they catch up on their texts, that's when they look at their email, that's what they see what's going on Twitter.
Yeah.
So I have found that actually the more I have some kind of regular breaks, the more there's that, the less you experience people being distracted during the play.
Right.
To just, okay, let's step away from the table for a second. Let's refresh our drinks.
Yeah.
And then we'll keep going.
I didn't think about that before, but that's a very 2017 tip for Dungeons and Dragons play. But
and it's something, again, I'm very conscious about, and I do it even in convention play. Unless I'm running a kind of a shorter adventure, but especially if I'm running a 3 or 4 hour adventure, I will say, all right, I will usually have several breaks.
Right, and let people know they're like, okay, there's going to be a break come up in 15 minutes, and that is enough sometimes for people not to be checking their phone.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah. So something else that is a really good table rule is outside of combat, where in combat, people have turns in a particular order, so you never have to worry about somebody being overlooked. But when it's not combat, when people are not acting in turn order, I think it's important for DMs to just remember that everyone is there to play, and everyone's going to want a moment to say what their character is going to do, and also they're going to want to have a chance to step into the spotlight.
Yeah.
So one thing I do very consciously when I'm running non-combat scenes is make sure I do a kind of fairly regular sweep around the table to ask some form of the very basic question in D&D, and that is, what do you do? And often players will just tell me, and I don't have to do this. So, it's not artificial. You don't have to officially go around and, what do you do, Greg? What do you...
Yeah.
It happens very organically, but sometimes you'll notice, okay, these 3 players have been talking a lot and doing a lot. These other 2 or 3, they've been kind of quiet, and I don't know what their characters are doing. And so I often will tell actually people who are saying, all right, we're running over there, and then we're going to ask them this. And okay, now we're talking to this NPC. Mm-hmm. I'll often put them on pause and then go over to the other players and see, okay, so what are you guys doing? I also, and this is also a little tip I think is great for DMs, is when you're doing that outside of combat, when characters are doing different things, sometimes in different places, because parties often do split up outside of combat, especially if you're in a city or in kind of non-dungeon environment.
Yeah.
I often love to use that kind of focus shifting, right, where I switch from one player to another to create mini cliffhangers.
Right.
So often, I'll have somebody say, all right, I'm going to go over and investigate that bookshelf. And I, as a DM, know, okay, the cursed tome is in that bookshelf. And so I'll say, all right, you go up and you see this dark tome. And they're like, all right, I reach up for it. I'm like, all right, Mary, what are you doing? And so I will create these moments of tension where suddenly they're going to have to wait to find out what happens next.
Yeah.
And so I try to do that throughout a session. And again, one of the easiest ways as a DM you can do that is with that focus shifting. Shift to another character.
And that accomplishes so many things at once because it ramps up tension. It makes people wonder what that is. Like, why is there a dark tome and why did he shift away from there? And then it also does what you're talking about, is make sure that the people who don't feel like they have a spotlight have the spotlight for even a little bit. But I have a follow-up question, though. So what do you do when you ask someone, what do you do? And they're like, oh, I'm nothing. I'm not doing anything.
That's fine. Now, sometimes I might have a leading question for them. Like if I know there's something that in this scene that their character would normally be engaged about, I might remind them of that fact. I also will sometimes fill in those silences with a little bit of extra description. Like, oh, because I have a character who's just sort of chilling, just taking things in. Well, then I will sometimes then throw in, well, while you stand there.
These are the things that happen.
Yeah, you notice X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And then that's a chance for me to work in some exposition without an exposition dump truck kind of backing in and
beep,
dumping.
Beep, beep. Yeah.
And so, because that's also, when you break things up like this, it's also a technique for sprinkling environment descriptions, exposition, NPC descriptions in nice little bite-sized chunks.
Yeah, and that also make sure it by doing the description thing or like, sensory things such as like smell or touch, like it makes the world feel a little bit more richer if you do things like that. Even if it isn't necessarily exposition or important details, the fact that you're just giving them details makes it feel like, oh, I can smell the meat cooking and
Yes.
and I hear the music playing from the tavern across the way, like things that make it feel like it's a breathing world.
And that's often some of my favorite stuff to describe is I often, when I'm DMing, imagining myself standing where the characters are, and then I just do this kind of panorama in my head. And what are they smelling? What are they hearing?
It's like a little movie montage.
Exactly. Now, specifically about rules and the DM, some DMs like to have house rules, and then also DMs will sometimes be concerned about using particular rules in a session. So I have 2 tips here.
Okay.
If you're going to use a rule you don't normally use, like let's say they're going to dive down into the lost city that's sunk beneath some lake, and oh boy, there's going to be a lot of aquatic combat potentially. I always try to think ahead in any adventure I'm running, and I think, what are the unusual rules I might be using in this session, and I make sure to reread those rules before the session, so that I don't have that awkward moment at the table where, like, I don't remember how aquatic combat works. Hold, please.
You designed the game, Jeremy.
Right.
Know.
Well, we're pretending I'm just a regular DM when I say this.
No, but you're right. And then also, it's the same tip as for the players, is like have that open at your table when you're about to start that session, or flagged or up on your phone if you're using D&D Beyond, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Now, again, like I said before, if you don't read up on it beforehand and you don't want to take the time to look it up during your session, just wing it, make something up, and be willing to course correct after the session. Best not to do course correction during the session where suddenly, like midway through, you're like, oh no, let's completely change how we're running this, and then your session turns into a forum on the rules, and again, that's usually not why people gathered around to play.
And then it feels like you're playing Calvin Ball.
Right. So
what was the other?
House rules.
Yes.
Many groups like to have specific house rules that they reuse for an entire campaign. I think that's great. A big part of D&D is tinkering and making it your own. I recommend, though, that groups try to be as conservative as possible about how many house rules they use. And the reason why I give this suggestion is it's very easy for house rules to start almost like self-replicating, where you end up, if it gets too out of control, you can end up with a whole parallel rule set, and suddenly your players are trying to remember not only how like the game normally works, but also how your customized version of the game works. So just as if, let's say, we were designing a special set of rules for one of our settings, we would want to zero in on what are just a few new rules that will really bring this setting to life or this particular adventure location to life, rather than this whole constellation of new rules. Like, zero in on what's going to be the most impact, what's going to make your game feel unique. Go for that with your house rules. Go for a big swing, basically. Don't like sort of like,
tinker.
I changed the bonus in this, one ability from, your shield spells because I think shield is too strong, now does +2 instead of +5. When you're doing that kind of micro tinkering, sure, if that's your bliss, go for it. But again, the cost is you are increasing the number of things your players are going to have to track. And so I'd say go for high impact house rules that really make your game feel special. And often this is a great thing to do when you're doing a special genre in your campaign. Let's say you decided we're going to do mythic fantasy, and our heroes are, they're not just regular D&D characters, they're figures like Hercules and whatnot. And so you might decide that all the characters start off with the equivalent of one of the blessings and other sort of epic abilities we suggest in the Dungeon Master's Guide. You might decide, I'm giving those at first level, or something like them. And that's a great example of that. That would be a strong statement in your campaign. Show right away, this is how our campaign is different, without a lot of kind of micro tinkering that a person is going to have to keep track of. I also another reason why I caution people about going too hog wild with house rules is often I will see people creating house rules to address what they perceive to be gaps in the system, but often a rule does exist in the system. And Often it's though something in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I notice that people often do not remember how many options there are in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I mean, that book is kind of bursting at the seams with optional rules, different ways you can adjudicate things, different tips for building things. So the game often already has what it is you're looking for. So I'd recommend just do a deeper dive, and there's a good chance you don't need to do any work. There's a good chance we already did it for you.
Yeah, and I would suggest a lot of people, I mean, I know a lot of people already have the Dungeon Master's Guide and have read it and consumed it, but I think there's this idea that once you've read through it, it's magic items and a few other things that you need to like reference on a day-to-day basis while you're playing in the session. But you are correct in that there are so many variants and ways to think about how to add on to this system with examples that are throughout the entire book that you're right. Many people will be like, oh, there's no thing for that. Well, actually, yes, it's on page 76, and you just skimmed over it because you were getting to the magic item section, right, of the Dungeon Master. So, yeah, it is one of the ones that where people are like, oh, I don't necessarily need that at the table in normal play, but it's something to think about when you're prepping your session or wanting to create a campaign that feels very unique.
And the variants and options in the Dungeon Master's Guide are great inspiration for creating house rules of your own, because many of them, the optional rules in particular, are basically house rules that we created to say, hey, here's one way you could customize your game. You know, like one example that I talked about recently in a Kotaku article is the option in the DMG for not rolling initiative for monsters. Just assume all monsters rolled a 10 on their D20 and add their dex mod, and you could even write that in as their initiative score on their stat blocks. And
I love that tip because it's like one less roll that you have to make, especially at the beginning of the session. And how many times have you done it and you're like, oh, I forgot to roll for the monsters after you're like a round or two in, and you're like, oh, yeah, they're going ahead of you guys, and that changed everything that has already happened. Yeah, and a lot of it's happened to me.
And what's funny is a lot of those optional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide are actually basically remnants of versions of the rules we play tested. So we came very close to printing an initiative score in the monster stat blocks in the monster manual. So that initiative score tip in the DMG actually arose from what almost made it into the official monster manual.
Because after that long playtest feedback, there was a lot of material that was just cut that was ended up being changed, right? And then
and a lot of stuff we were testing internally that actually never was in the public playtest because we were doing at the same time the public playtesting was going on. We were doing our own internal stress testing, and there were all sorts of things we tested. Because we were basically iterating through versions of the rules faster than the public could, because we also had to then process all the feedback from the public, so we couldn't send them out every week. Well, here's yet another version of the rules.
Yeah, and as a playtester, it was very tough to even keep up with the schedule that you had.
Yeah, and so we were at the same time just cycling through version after version after version, and then also debating different ways to do things. And this initiative score option was one of those things that it didn't make it into the final version, but it came close.
It's still there in the DMG.
Yeah, and it's
That's
there.
kind of cool.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. I feel like this is a great kind of overview of stuff that might have been overlooked in 5th edition and ways to make your table better. I don't know. Thanks for extolling upon all of these. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And as always, I'm now inspired to start DMing more than I already do.
More DMing.
More.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. How can people get in touch with you for more rules questions?
The best way is on Twitter, where I am Jeremy E. Crawford.
Awesome. And I'm at Greg Tito. You can ask me some of these questions, but most of the time I will just defer them to Jeremy. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about dungeon mastering or anything like that. So thank you very much, and we'll be back next week with another segment.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Excellent. Thank you, people on the Twitch. Of course, we were like, oh, we'll talk about that for 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. It's 2:44. That was a half hour.
We always do
half
that.
Hour stage advice segment. But we do want to open up to some questions to you guys. I know we had a few that we printed out from the last time we did this, but I'm always Want to take some more questions from you guys in the Twitch chat as well. And shout out to you guys. I was paying attention. You guys all had really great conversation and tips and things that you guys do at your tables, which I thought was really, really cool. So good conversation following along. I thought you guys did awesome. So yeah, feel free to throw any questions in there now. Use question in all caps so that we can check it out. At 3 p.m., we're going to have Thomas Foss sit here with Shelley. We're going to have that interview segment. He's actually in the room right now staring at me and cursing. Now he's throwing fire, rolling some dice at me. But stay tuned for that. In about 15 minutes, we'll get to him and pick his brain about Tomb of Annihilation in Neverwinter. All right, so Calvin Balla. Oh my gosh, I mentioned Calvin Ball in this segment. I hope that's what it's actually in reference to. If not, that's crazy. So how as a DM do I try to speed the game along between players feeling they need to over-prepare for every small challenge or just exercising the minutiae of traveling/living? All right, where's the question? How do I... as a DM, like more tips on how to speed the game along? I don't know. What do you think about that?
So I am a big fan of describing montages and then speeding things along. And I always look for cues from my players to see what catches their interest. So if let's say I start describing a city street, and anyone who's played with me knows I can get carried away because boy do I love describing places in D&D. But I often will do a lot of it up front. And this is actually a tip I could have just given in the segment we just completed.
Right.
I will often give a big description at the beginning of an adventure to kind of get a feel from my players, because I will watch as I'm describing what causes them to kind of look more interested. Their eyes will kind of glimmer with like, ooh, I want to. I can tell they want to know more, or I can see they actually already want to, like, they're basically almost like teacher.
Yeah.
They want to ask a question about something I just said. And so I will remember, okay, what caught their attention, and those are the things I'll then slow down on. Now, in my home group, my players are great at just slowing things down on their own. And this is why I have to, I don't know if I've ever said it before on Twitch, but I have to be really careful if I ever have shops around, because my God, do my players love to shop. And so anytime shops are around, I'm like, we're about to lose 30 minutes of playtime, because they're not only going to want to buy things, they're going to want to talk to everyone who works in the shops because they want to pump them for information. So yeah, watch out for shops.
Watch out for shops, or like just lean into it, because
which is what I do. So the thing is I take that as an opportunity to have the NPCs tell them about the city. Basically, I always look for every moment in D&D to be a chance to convey part of the story, some world texture, something that's funny. Or I'm often looking for the players to basically feed me adventure ideas. Yeah. Because often the things that they will say they think is happening, or the things they say they want to learn more about, I'll basically like, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to make that be what's happening.
Yeah, it's better than what I prepared. Yep. And this is going back to the beginning of your segment about not over-preparing. It's like, yeah, just take the cues from them. Almost like it's I don't know if you guys know about long-form improv, but like it's almost just taking the one thing and then you're like, all right, well, that's what the session is going to be about today. Yep. So why not?
Yeah.
I like that.
But yeah, but otherwise DMs, if you want to just keep things moving quickly and jump from one scene to another, there is no shame in doing that. Mm-hmm. Because the always remember, in a way, you're kind of, it's almost like you're the showrunner for a TV show.
Yeah.
And sometimes, the best written shows will slow down and you really get immersed in a particular scene with a particular group of characters. You might even have an entire episode of a TV show that zeroes in on almost 1 hour of real time. Then the very next episode might basically show months of time passing, and there's no problem in D&D with basically changing your time focus from one session to another. And in fact, I think that's one way to keep a campaign feeling dynamic and making it so that you're always focusing on the good stuff.
What if you have a campaign or show in which the opening sequence is all about establishing the space and how big and sprawling it is?
I know what
but
you're
then
asking
in your
about.
Last season, they ping pong all over the world, which is actually very D&D, because that does happen. When you get to high levels, you get flying carpets, you get dragon friends and allies that you can ping across the world. It just never really was explained in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, so anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, it's the fact that in the most recent season of Game of Thrones, apparently everyone learned the teleportation spell, and they are bamfing around
ships and
Westeros.
Dragons. They can go. It's blink of an eye when it took seasons to get from place to place. Now it takes 10 minutes. Yeah. Good question. Thank you for that. I saw another one in here that I definitely thought was up your alley. Okay, this one is from Matt Siff. We'll get to one of those too in a second. But how do you deal with someone claiming something is overpowered?
So my response would be different depending on context. So if, let's say, they're bringing it up at the table, at the game table, I would say just keep things moving. Away from the table, I would take a look at it and see as DM if I was truly concerned about it. But at the end of the day, I as DM am rarely concerned about player things that get really powerful, because the thing is the DM can always adjust numbers up. This goes back to something I was saying in the podcast segment, that players don't know what's behind the DM screen. Players don't know how many hit points your guys have. If suddenly the player is using some combination, particularly let's say they're multi-classing and they're using feats, and they've stumbled upon some combination that is crazily effective and feels at the table like, ooh, this might be a little too powerful. Thing is, the DM can just increase the monster's hit points by 25%, cause their DCs to be higher, cause them to deal more damage. The DM basically has a lot of dials to turn at the game table that never have to be visible to the players. Because again, what the DM's role is make sure things feel dramatic, make sure they feel exciting.
Right. So the only danger I would say in this ramping up HP is that then each fight turns into you're just adding time to the end of the fight.
Well, and that's why I would never recommend doing it across the board as a rule.
Right.
It should always just be in the moment. It always get a read on the particular moment. Like, let's say a fight you feel would be more exciting if it had another round or two of play. Then you can increase that dial.
Yeah.
The flip side is, let's say it's a slog, and let's say each of your monsters, the player characters are whittling them away, and you have a bunch of guys who are down to like 5 hit points, 6 hit points, 8 hit points. The players don't know they have, that amount of hit points left. And I will often have creatures like they'll get hit by something and it will leave them with 3 hit points remaining. I'm like, you killed it!
Yay! Right.
But if I feel like, no, it's not dramatically appropriate for that, then I will just go exactly by how many hit points they have left, and that guy will still stand there with the 3 hit points.
And it's not quite fudging the dice. It's more just like making things feel appropriate for the encounter that you want it to be.
Yes, and also, because I know some DMs who really like to play the game as written, and I fully support DMs who want to try to play the game the way we wrote it.
Yeah.
So this next part is for you, DM. If you're in that position, if you want to play the game as it's written, you can rest assured that modifying monster hit points is playing within the rules. You're not cheating as a DM when you do that, because remember, we give you in every monster stat block that monster's range of possible hit points. And the hit points printed in the stat block is the average. It's what we expect a typical version of that monster to have. And also, frankly, it's what the challenge rating is based on. But if you want to slide the hit points down or up within the monster's range given by its hit dice and its constitution modifier, go for it.
Yeah.
And you are abiding by the rules when you do so. And it's fine if doing that would technically cause the monster's challenge rating to go up or down, because basically that kind of thing all comes out in the wash.
Right.
And don't sweat it. What's important is, does the game feel right in the moment?
I like that.
And the final thing I'll say about overpowered, there are some combos in the game that are crazy good. However, a lot of the time when I or someone else in the team investigates a combination that has been proclaimed broken, it's going to destroy the game, we often find that the analysis is based on forgetting a rule There will often be a rule somewhere in the game that actually controls the overpowered thing they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we look at it and said, well, yes, this is overpowered, assuming you're ignoring the rules.
Yeah.
Or it's often based on math mistakes. We will often look at it and then recreate the scenario they're talking about. And we're like, yes, this is overpowered if you ignore arithmetic.
If you ignore reality and how numbers work, then yes.
But sometimes, yes, indeed, things are crazy good. And then I just recommend a DM adjust things on the fly.
Now, do you ever think, we only have 5 minutes, so I feel like I'm taking away from another question, so I won't ask you my follow-up question, but we'll save it for another time. So there was one here you wanted to get to.
I saved from last time.
Yeah.
Let's see. If a player manages to get next to a sleeping target, why is it necessary to make an attack against it with advantage as opposed to it being an automatic hit? That's a great question. So the reason that you still have to make an attack roll is that armor class doesn't just represent the ability of a creature to dodge out of the way. It also represents, in the case of you wearing armor, the ability of your armor to blunt a blow. But in the case of a monster with natural armor, it also represents the ability of their scales or some other feature of their body to turn a blow into essentially a miss, because D&D abstracts a bit of the combat where whenever you're rolling to hit, you're not just rolling to see if you struck true, you're rolling to see if you struck true and dealt damage.
Enough to do damage.
Exactly.
Right?
Because the assumption in D&D is you're actually often, when the game says you missed, you might actually have made contact.
Mm-hmm.
You might actually have slammed your sword onto the dragon's flank. This is actually how I often describe it when a person comes really close to hitting. Let's say the armor class is 16 and they rolled a 15.
Yeah.
Often how I'll describe it is actually they managed to make contact, but they didn't hit hard enough.
Yeah.
They didn't get through the armor.
Or it was deflected aside.
It was parried.
Or if someone has a shield. Right, which wouldn't do any damage at all.
Yeah. So the attack roll is representing not only accuracy, it is also representing, did you strike well enough to actually deal damage?
Yeah.
And so that is why even when you're striking at somebody who's unconscious, you still have to make that attack roll, and with advantage. So it's very likely you're going to hit. Because, again, they might have some defensive quality that makes them very hard to injure.
Okay, all right. I mean, I'm thinking of previous editions with the coup de grace, that attack action, and how it was an automatic hit, and then he would roll damage so that the chance there was how much damage you did, right? Well, and for me, that made sense because you were like pulling their hair and like trying to slit their throat or something like that. So it was like, all right, you were pretty much assumed of doing damage. It was just like how good you are at slitting someone's throat.
Wow.
Which is a terrible
dark.
Yeah. But like, I mean, that's the kind of thing that tries to get modeled by these rules. And so, I've had that moment of frustration that I think the person who asked the question was talking about, in that like, why but once you realize you're in the context of a battle where things are happening and each round is only 6 seconds,
right?
You get only of a small window of being able to actually do the thing that you're trying to do.
And we've talked about this in another segment. If you do hit, let's say it's an unconscious target, a feature of the unconscious condition is it's automatically a critical hit. So you are doing extra damage. This is assuming you're right next to the person.
Yeah.
Then the damage you're going to do is going to be higher than normal. Now, outside combat, there have been many cases as DM where I don't have any dice rolled, particularly if the person that is being attacked is kind of a lowly NPC who would be unlikely to survive the hit anyway. I just say it just happens. Whereas if it's a strong, like it's a monster, like a dragon that's sleeping and they got the jump on it, or somebody else and combat hasn't started yet, I'd still make them roll the to-hit roll, because it's like, that dragon has those scales. that sleeping wizard, might have some defense in place.
Something to make it more difficult than just as simple as you players want it to be.
Right. And also the thing is as a story game, some of D&D's rules are not at all about verisimilitude or things being physically believable. Some of the rules are based entirely about how important is something to the narrative. A great example of this is the fact that when player characters, who are the stars of the story, when they're reduced to 0 hit points, unless they've taken massive damage, they're not killed by it. They're knocked unconscious. Whereas monsters, they're killed. Except we say in the rules, but if it's an important NPC or, a monster that's an important villain, the DM can opt to have them follow the same rule as the player characters where they are knocked unconscious instead of killed. So again, that's an example of a rule that has nothing to do with the physical reality, and it's all about the narrative and what's important to the story.
That makes sense. Yeah. All right. I like it. Our time here is done. I wish maybe we should schedule at some point like a whole hour of just asking questions, because I feel like we got a lot of questions that we didn't get to. So I apologize to you guys. It's mostly my fault. I'm going to blame myself. I'm way too verbose. I talk too much.
Even though I'm the one who carries on.
Still, I should know that ahead of time going in. But no, thank you guys so much for all of your questions. Again, I thought even just now you guys are talking about different tips that you use in the thing, which I think is fantastic. And I love the community that's around dungeon mastering now. So thank you, Jeremy. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, maybe with some more sage advice.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
We're going to take a little break, and then we'll be back with Shelley and Thomas Voss, who are now in the room, and we'll sit down and get some things happening. All right. Thank you, guys. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Woo.
And you too, Tito.
Woo.